encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network.
Welcome to Inside the Scholar's Study, where we discuss all things concerning Scripture, faith, and scholarship. My name is Brad McNutt. If you're ready, we're going to go inside the Scholar's Study, and we're going to continue this season we've been discussing, which has been quite popular, we've learned up to this point. Had some, very interesting interactions, and I say that in the best way possible. Not in a negative sense yet. I mean, they may be coming, but I don't know. But looking at textual criticism of the New Testament texts. So where are we headed today?
Well, we'll step back a little bit and just talk about general ideas here. Textual criticism, why that needs to be done. I don't reckon we've done that before, but even though we've gotten quite a bit of experience with certain aspects of it. But let's take a step back. I do have a PowerPoint here. I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can get to that. Let me see if I can do the slideshow version of this. All right, so the problem with copies, and we're talking about copies of the Bible, copies of biblical books, particularly the New Testament, so copies of sections of the New Testament. All right, we're talking about hand copies, mostly manuscripts. So what are the problems involved in that? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that we do not have in our possession today, they don't exist anywhere, the autograph copies of the New Testament books or the Old Testament books or pretty much any book that was ever written in the history of the world before, I don't have this exactly firmly in my head, but something like before the year 1000, pretty much any literary work, we don't have the autograph copy of that. So anything written by Plato or certainly Homer or Cicero or whatever, Justin Martyr or Irenaeus or Augustine, we don't have the autograph copies of that. What is an autograph copy? It is the original. So the copy of Romans that Paul held in his hands, or that, let's say, Tertius held in his hands, is the autograph copy. Those don't exist. Now, I will say, Brad, that I've learned something recently about this term autograph. I didn't realize it, but I've been reading this book called, do you see that, Brad?
Stolen Fragments.
Yeah, it's this book called Stolen Fragments by Roberta Mazza. She's an Italian papyrologist. The subtitle is Black Markets, Bad Faith, and the Illicit Trade in Ancient Artifacts. It's a lot about like the Green family at Hobby Lobby and the Museum of the Bible and all the trouble that, I don't know if you were aware of that, Brad, the trouble they got into with Dirk Obink and all that, where some of their, quite a number of their like papyri, New Testament papyri, or just other artifacts were sort of not properly sourced. There was somewhat breaking of international law. Look, I don't know exactly in the year 2024 when we're recording this. I don't know exactly where we are on that. I think the Green family and the Museum of the Bible has returned a lot of things and tried to make right. And Dirk Obink has been arrested, and maybe we'll get to that. Some people might not have any idea who Dirk Obink is. He was he was an American, but he was working at Oxford. He was a super famous papyrologist, and it turned out he sold things that did not belong to him, apparently, or that's the accusation. I don't know if he's been convicted of it. I forget exactly how it is. This book just came out this year, by the way, so once I get done with it, maybe I will know how it has all turned out. But I've enjoyed reading it. But she talks about she is apparently not an evangelical Christian. I don't know if she is a Christian at all, but she talks about this the term. Um, am I? She talks about the term autograph
Mm-hmm.
as if it is a peculiar term for evangelicals. Like
Hmm.
evangelicals call them autographs. And she's done it several times in the book. I don't know, at least 3 times. And she'll put it in scare quotes as if this is a term that nobody else uses. Only evangelical Christians use this term. So
Hmm.
I don't know. I mean, I put it down in my note. Is this an evangelical term? So she seems to think it's weird. So it's just something to, I guess, hang on to, that maybe this is a weird term.
Hmm.
But anyway, I mean, it's a useful term. I say, I don't know what else you're going to call the things. The original copy, the
Yeah.
autograph. Yeah.
It just, I mean, it just, I
Yeah,
don't
it
know. I
makes sense.
mean,
Right.
the individual's writing, that's kind of what the word means. I mean, it kind of
Yeah.
looks, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if you go to the SBL. I mean, I don't know that I've ever thrown around the word autograph at the SBL, but maybe people won't have any idea what I'm talking about, or maybe they'll think I'm talking about my autograph or something like that. Like, you want me to sign your book or something?
Yeah.
I don't know. So anyway, uh, uh, w- the original copies, we do not have those copies. And like I say, we don't have the original copies for any book up until about the year 1000, I think, somewhere in there, maybe 1100. You're going to start to get literary works where we actually do have the original manuscript copy, where the actual guy, whoever it is, Anselm or
Mm.
somebody, actually wrote it with their own hand. But before that, we don't. So, what do we have? We only have copies and copies of copies and copies of copies of copies. Now, let me say this, though, that Craig Evans has recently, in the past, what is this? This is 2024. So it's been 10 years now. He has been promoting this idea that maybe those autograph copies, like the copy of Matthew that was originally written, maybe that would have been sort of in circulation, or not in circulation, but stored
Mm.
and um, available, known about, preserved for 100 years, 200 years. He's found a lot of. He's been publishing on this. Let me see if I don't think I have the book in my office, but he first published about this in 2015. This is a guy named Craig Evans. He is an evangelical Christian, but he's a scholar. Published a whole bunch of stuff,
Mm.
and then let's see. I've found another article by him in a book from 2021, I think, sort of an expanded version where he's promoting this idea, and he's got some evidence that in ancient times you could have like a papyrus manuscript or a leather manuscript that would be in use for hundreds of years.
Mm.
And so maybe the original autograph copies of some of the New Testament writings were in use for hundreds of years. So let's say the Gospel of Matthew was written in, let's just say, 70 AD, and maybe it would have been around and used for 100 years up until 170 AD, or maybe 200 years to 270 AD. All of that to say, do we have, is it copies of copies of copies of copies, or is it just copies,
Mm.
copies of copies? How far do we go? I don't know. We definitely don't have the autographs. Um, and I will say, like, Craig Evans' argument about the longevity of the autographs has, I think, maybe not been so persuasive to people who have really studied it. But in general, I mean, it sort of makes sense to me that that might be the case. Anyway, we'll move on from that. We don't have the autographs.
Yeah, I would think sometimes that would, I mean, just obviously
Yeah.
not an expert of any kind, but you would think that having a copy available so other people could copy it. But I
Yeah.
also, you think about how do you it would be impossible to trace, okay, it was sent to this country. Okay, well, 10 churches in this country copied that copy. I mean, it,
Yeah.
it would just be kind of hard to. It's interesting. I just don't know how you could.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I mean, there's some plausibility to it. And I'll say, I mean, since we're using the Gospel of Matthew as an illustration, I also have on my shelf another book published this year that I have not read yet, but it's by Nicholas Elder and it's called Gospel Media. And it's basically about the production. How would ancient books be produced? How would they be copied? How would they be published? How would people know about them? And then those ideas in general, and then also specifically as applied to the four gospels that are in our New Testament. So, like I say, I haven't read it yet, but I'm throwing that out there again as to listeners as a possible avenue if you want more about this. But I think, I mean, without having read that particular book, I think the basic idea of what do you do with a gospel once you've written the thing? Let's say the Gospel of Matthew. What did Matthew do with it? I would assume that he gave it to a church. Let's say the church at Antioch, like a big time church, not like the Podunk Church of Christ or something, but like a big well known church that where there's always people coming and going, visiting and stuff, and they would be able to advertise, we've got this important book, and knowledge of it could spread so that the church in Rome has now heard that Antioch has this thing called a gospel according to Matthew, and they send some scribes to Antioch with some papyrus to copy it out so that they can have a copy, and then the word spreads and copies are made. And it's not like it's carried around in somebody's backpack, but it's deposited in a building for safekeeping and for the very purpose of allowing scribes to come and make copies. And how long would it remain in that position before that particular copy is retired and another copy takes its place? Well, if it's just sitting there being copied, I would think it could last, like Evans argues, a couple hundred years, I suppose. It like I don't have the evidence. All I have is guesses, and um, it seems plausible to me that that could work, but you know, I don't know, maybe not. So any copy inevitably has errors in it without divine intervention. And what we can tell from the copies that we are looking at is apparently God chose not to intervene in terms of preserving, let's say, preserving all the copies from errors. Certainly, he didn't do that. Did he preserve any of the copies from any error whatsoever? Well, I don't think we have evidence to go in that direction. So, what we can say is anytime you copy anything out by hand, I mean, not by hand, anytime even if you're just like looking at a copy and you're typing it out, right? I mean, how many times are you going to make typos? Let's say you copy out, what should we say, Little Red Riding Hood. And you are going to either write it out by hand or you're going to type it up. You're going to make plenty of typos in doing that. I mean, there's no doubt. Now, usually Word or Google Docs or something is going to do a little squiggly red line and you're going to go back and fix it, or you're going to run spell check.
Or even,
But
I mean, if you're writing, I think about writing papers. Like sometimes, I mean, spell check will want to correct things and correct the grammar of things that
yeah,
are not. I mean, and I can't,
yeah,
you skip a line and you don't mean to because you've been staring at it for a really long time, and
man, yeah.
it's
Just
indelible.
this morning, I think it was just this morning. Yeah, doing. I'm correcting. I've got this book that I'm almost done with. It's going to be called, or it is called, it will be called Satan and His Friends. Have I told you about that one, Brad?
I
Um,
think somewhat that it was. I
okay.
knew it was away at a publisher, maybe, but
Yeah, yeah. So it's going to come out with Abilene Christian University Press, probably in like, I don't know, 8 months, something like that. So I think it'll be out some like July of 2025. And so I'm trying to turn it. We're in the current month where we're recording this is October, and I've got to get it to the publisher by the end of October. So I'm reading over the typescript just one last time to make sure I say everything I want to say and the way I want to say it. So of course I'm finding typos and mistakes all over the place. Now I don't know how many times I've read these chapters. I mean, I have read them maybe a dozen times by now, maybe more than that for some of the chapters. And I, this morning, I found the word broad, like, the way is broad. And
mm-hmm.
it was misspelled. It was Braod. I found it. And I looked at it for a second. Is that how you spell that? It's like, no, the O and the A need to be switched.
Mm-hmm.
So just once again, more and more typos. So look, God has not seen fit to preserve me from typos. God has not seen fit to preserve the scribes from mistakes. There are errors in the copy of anything you want to say. Homer, Plato, Cicero, Paul, Matthew. When I say of errors, of course, I'm talking about the copies, the copying. Right? We can talk about you know the perfection of the autograph copies. I'm happy to hypothesize about that and think about that. We don't have those autograph copies. We have copies of copies. Um, so they all have some errors in them, or let's say they are all different from one another in some ways. And that's just the way it is. And you can go back to ancient Christianity, and people understood this, like if you're going to, like, this is one of the essential features that when you study a work, it can be the Bible, it can be a pagan literature. If you study any sort of work, let's say you're going to study a Cicero treatise, then one of the first things you do when you do that is you get two copies of it or three, and you make comparisons, and you're gonna base your reading on one particular copy, but you're going to correct it first because going in there's going to be mistakes in it. The scribe has not been perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect scribe. And so that going in. And we have accounts of people saying this, Origen talking about it, for instance, this early Christian writer from the 3rd century talking about making corrections to his copy of the parts of the Bible. So they were familiar with this. We have emphasized in previous episodes that it's really with the invention of printing that you can have two different copies of the same work that say the exact same thing. You don't have that before printing. It just doesn't exist. Two different copies of the same work are going to be different from each other in some ways. So that's the problem with like hand copies anyway, or non-print copies. Of course, this includes modern printing. Um, so let's see. With Shakespeare's works, I mean, textual criticism proceeds with regard to Shakespeare's works. Or what was the? Let's see. When I was at Freed Hardman, I was a student at Freed Hardman, a college in Henderson, Tennessee, and the one of the professors was this guy named Gerald Fulkerson. He has since passed on, But I remember when I was there, he was working on a critical edition of one of the works of Frederick Douglass. And I just looked it up earlier, Brad, and found it on Amazon. And it's Douglass's most famous work, Frederick Douglass, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And you can, of course, you can find all kinds of editions of that autobiography. But one of the editions you can find on Amazon is one edited by Gerald Fulkerson. And so he was engaged in textual criticism of that work. Of course, I mean, Frederick Douglass, I don't know exactly how to go about doing textual criticism on the works of Frederick Douglass. Obviously, Frederick Douglass himself would have written it out by hand first and then, I guess, turned it over to the printer or something like this. I don't ever do that myself. I always type it out. I don't write it out longhand. I type it out and then make corrections that way. But I don't know if you're doing textual criticism on. Do you have copies of the original handwriting of Douglass? I maybe it was only 200 years ago, so perhaps. And I remember, I mean, just as another example, what's the Great Gatsby? A book by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I don't remember what the sentence was, but I remember reading the introduction to that book in a copy of that book, and the introduction at one point was talking about a correction in the text that older editions had the word saw, SAW, and the editor of this version of The Great Gatsby had gone back to look at Fitzgerald's actual manuscript copy of the novel, and he saw that the word saw was not in the text. It should be the word was, WAS, just the consonant switched around. And so in this edition of The Great Gatsby, it was corrected. Now, look, I don't think that change, I think that change was significant for the sentence where it appeared, but I'm not sure that it changes like the entire meaning of the novel or anything like that. It's a fairly small kind of change. I think for the most part, when we talk about textual criticism, look, the textual criticism can have pretty profound effects on the meaning of passages, the meaning, I mean, maybe the meaning of works at times, but a lot of times it doesn't have that significant. And that's what I think probably we already have in this season, emphasize that you can get the message of the gospel, you can get the message of the Bible, you can get the message that God wants to communicate, regardless, I think. But if you want to do a deep dive, if you want to do a study, I mean, these are kinds of things that are helpful to know. And that's the kind of thing we're doing here. All right, so
helpful note about F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby.
Yeah.
A tremendous fiction work is John Grisham's Camino Island, where there is a bookseller who breaks into the Princeton Library and steals first editions and precious manuscripts of The Great Gatsby, and then is being investigated by the FBI. It's a fun read. You should read it.
What is the name of the book again?
It's called Camino Island.
Camino Island. Okay. I haven't heard of that one, but
John Grisham, he's my guy.
John Grisham, I've heard of that one, but yeah. Okay, good. Thank you for the recommendation.
Anything, that's what I bring to Inside the
Yeah. So another example, maybe we've mentioned this one before. I can't remember. Maybe it was in class, but Ruth 3:15. This is referring to a copy of the King James Version. I'm trying to get to Ruth here. Joshua judges Ruth. There are copies of the King James Bible that are called He Bibles. I mean, I'm talking about like early copies, close to 1611. I don't know if these came out in 1611. I can't remember. Maybe it was 1612, 1613. But there are copies that are, and I'm sure Wikipedia knows all about this. So if you want more information, just type in He Bible and She Bible into Wikipedia, and you can probably get an article about it. But it's based on Ruth 3:15, which I'm going to read the New Revised Standard Version here. It says, "Then he said, 'Bring the cloak you are wearing and hold it out.' So she held it and measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her back. Then," this is at the very end of Ruth 3:15, "then he went into the city." Or is it she went into the city? Well, some copies of this early edition of the King James Version had he went into the city, and some had she went into the city. So they're called he Bibles or she Bibles. So even, printing doesn't mean, of course, you have typos and other kinds of mistakes that creep into printed copies. Um, maybe we did mention the Wicked Bible. I'm sure Wikipedia knows about it as well. It's where the word "not" was left out of, what is that? The 7th commandment? You shall commit adultery. Whichever one that is. Is that the 8th commandment? Or which one is that? 7th.
7. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. 8 is steal, right? Okay. So this quote is from Neil Lightfoot in his book How We Got the Bible. So errors were made, errors were copied, and errors were mixed in with the pure text. All right, so that's why you do textual criticism. You try to get the copies together and try to figure out what is the earliest form of the text we can get. What did the original say? That's why you do this. So again, Lightfoot says the textual critic seeks by comparison and study of all the available evidence to recover the exact words of the author's original composition. Now, I think I've mentioned before, let me try to see. I'm trying to find this book that I'm about to mention, but where it has gone. I don't know. I feel like it's somewhere on my desk, but I'm not seeing it right now. But if I were going to recommend just like a basic book on how we got the Bible, it would probably not be at this point Neil Lightfoot's book, How We Got the Bible, although that used to be a good sort of overview of it. I would say like it's a little outdated, especially in the quotation that I just have given you. And there are just more recent and better things like that. So Scribes and Scripture by Gurry and Mead is probably the one. I mean, it is the one I would recommend. I think it'll be helpful to people. But like, what Lightfoot says here is, it's close enough to the idea. You're going to take all the evidence you have, especially the Greek when we're talking about the New Testament, especially the Greek manuscripts, but not just the Greek manuscripts. Besides that, you're going to use like quotations of scripture among the early Christian writers, and you're going to use the ancient translations. And then there might be some, those are the 3 major categories of evidence. There might be some other things. And you're going to take all this into account, and you're going to try to reconstruct what the original had, or the closest you can get to it. People call it these days the initial text. The initial text, which is not the same theoretically as the original text, even though initial and original sounds pretty close. But it's the text from which all of the other copies derive, which might be the original text, I guess, but it's sort of a less confident version of that. Textual criticism applies to all texts, even modern ones, and I've already given the example of Frederick Douglass and F. Scott Fitzgerald. And so the result is a critical edition. I can't remember exactly if we've talked about this, but I can go ahead and remind listeners about how this works. So a critical edition is an edition of a text that is usually that is going to have a critical apparatus at the bottom of the page. That is, oftentimes a critical edition is going to be a reconstruction of what the original or the initial text said. And then at the bottom of the page, there's going to be sort of the notes that say, well, this manuscript says this and this manuscript says that. And we've seen pictures of critical edition of the New Testament before, so we know what that looks like. That the top part is the text as reconstructed, and the bottom part is the critical apparatus. I do want to note that you can have a critical edition. I think some people would not call this a critical edition, but other people would. You can have a critical edition that is not a reconstruction. So the standard edition of the Hebrew Bible, for instance, if you get the critical edition of the Hebrew Bible, it is not a reconstruction. At the top of the page, the text in Hebrew is just a copy of one particular manuscript. They have taken one manuscript and printed the readings of that manuscript at the top of the page. And then there is a critical apparatus that say, well, the Dead Sea Scrolls say this, and the Septuagint says that, and other medieval manuscripts say this other thing. So they do have those notes, but it's not, the top of the page is not a reconstruction of an original text. It's just the copy. That's called a diplomatic edition.
There is a critical edition in Works, isn't there?
In Works, there is, yes. The SBL is published, the Society of Biblical Literature, and one biblical book, as far as I know, one biblical book has been published so far, and that is the book of Proverbs, and it was published in 2015, edited by Michael Fox, and that was already 10 years ago. So where the others are, I don't know, but I guess it takes a while but Michael Fox knew what he was doing. I guess he got his done quick. So yeah, there is an eclectic text, a reconstruction being produced, but it has not resulted in much yet. Well, I'm sort of thinking maybe we'll cut off this episode there. We've talked about a lot of things, and we can pick up here next time.
Yeah. So this one has been, when you think about, well, I'll get my shots right here in just a minute. That's not what that is. Something's not working right. But anyway.
You're trying to put us both on there?
Yes, I am.
There we are.
The commands are not doing what they're lined up to do for some reason on my keyboard. But anyway, this gets into this could potentially, I don't know exactly where every person is who is listening to this as far as their understanding of things. And this has led for some people asking questions about inspiration, how we view inspiration, and
well, I was just going to let you address those questions, Brad.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. As if people, have you ever? There's a GIF that you can get, on your phone, and it's of the bunny in Secret Life of Pets looking confused, like that would be like my version of it.
Yeah.
But anyway, sometimes part of this process, and I think we've mentioned it before, is developing a more holistic, maybe even realistic view of not inspiration is certainly true with autographs as we've talked about, but inspiration, as you said, did not turn into dictation of copies of copies of copies of copies. That does not in any way compromise the integrity of the text. I think what textual criticism has been able to do is show that the ones that are even big time questionable don't really alter anything. And so, I would just encourage people, stick with us. We'll try and talk about it a little bit more. Some of these things will naturally come up, but we might have to tweak our understanding of inspiration, or I should say transmission, or something along those lines.
Yeah. Like, right. What kind of Bible do we have? Something like that. Like, I think when you don't examine evidence and you just sort of sit in your office or your house and sort of imagine what you would like God to have done, and then you come up with this theory of what the Bible is and what is it that I'm holding in my hands, and that might be quite divorced from reality. And then when you start looking at like how has the Bible actually come down to us, some of those ideas need to go out the window with what God has actually done. Yeah, I remember I learned. Was it was it just earlier that I talked about Freed Hardman? Yeah, right, Gerald Fulkerson. Well, another professor at Freed Hardman, like one who first taught me about textual criticism just very lightly, was Dow Flatt. And I remember him saying, he very gently and lightly addressed these issues about inspiration, and he said, we would, if it had been up to us, if we had been in the place of God, we probably would not have allowed the book of the law to be lost for however many years it was lost as we read about in 2 Kings chapter 22 about the rediscovery of the book of the law. It probably, we would have said it'd be best if the book of the law just wouldn't, and God shouldn't allow that to happen. But, we read that it happened. And so we can like sort of hypothesize and speculate if we had been God, how we would have gone about the process of preserving scripture or transmitting it. But it's probably more valuable to like look at what has actually happened. Like what are the manuscripts? What kind of evidence do they supply to us? What kind of differences do they have? And then try to develop ideas for what God has done from the evidence before us. I mean, I myself am committed to the doctrine of inspiration, the inspiration of Scripture. I'm also committed to seeing the manuscripts for what they are and not being blind to any sort of differences or problems that we have there. And I think, plenty of other people as well are committed to those same two things. And, they can be held together. We just might have to leave out some ideas that are not very well founded about what God should have done or whatever, things like that.
Right. So we will, I don't know, we'll continue to just stick with us. We'll continue to kind of, as it fits in, hopefully answer some questions you may have in your mind. And if you have them, send them on. That way we can, for me, I like questions because I can know exactly what people are thinking, and you can speak straight to that particular question. And so you can email us at scholars@thelightnetwork.tv. We had a number of interactions, a number of emails received this last week, and we always enjoy that interaction. I want to remind you that episodes of this podcast are released each and every Wednesday. You can find them in podcasting platforms on YouTube. Social media platforms of the Light Network will alert you to their release. It's not hard to find. I hope Deion Sanders has not trademarked that particular statement, not hard to find, because I might owe him some money. But anyway, we'll let Robert pay it. But it's not hard to find, and we are grateful that you have been with us today, and hope that you'll be with us again next week as we go back inside the Scholar Study.